Hi, thanks for being here. I would like, obviously, to tell you something about performance and how you can tackle performance problems. Who am I? I'm the one in the middle. I have the great honor to work together with some of the smartest people I've ever met from iTunes, my friends from Typefox. We used to work together for nearly 8 years, and it's always a pleasure to be associated with such a great piece of software, Xtext. And I used to work with Xtext and for Xtext for around 8.5 years. And it's still such a pleasure to see what people can do with Xtext. And today, I would like to invite you to see what problems we are sometimes facing in customers' project and what you can do about that. Not everything that you will learn today is a common strategy to solve a problem. Sometimes it's a compromise. And when you know what the implications are, then you might get around a problem that you currently have. Okay, who doesn't know Xtext? That's good. Because I don't want to give an introduction to that. It's a more or less advanced talk, and hopefully all of you have your own experience with Xtext. So just to wrap up what currently is doable with Xtext, of course, we have the integration in Eclipse. Everybody of you knows that. We have integration to the web. We have seen that in such great talks today. What you can do nowadays with the LSP and stuff around that, very amazing stuff. And of course, we have the integration in VS Code. Today I've learned something new. There is an integration in Monaco that looks fantastic, and I'm really thrilled to see what's doable there. Yeah, Xtext has a lot of defaults, but it's a good starting point with that. But you need to know how to customize that, because one size doesn't fit all. So sometimes the amount of DSLs increases. We have seen people building 80 DSLs. I don't know why, but they did it. Files might get bigger. You will see in my talk that sometimes people tend to use 200,000 lines in one file. I don't know why, but they do it. And the amount of files will increase. That means the amount of models you have in your workspace. And that has some implications. And of course, people tend to do everything via cross-references. And sometimes they do that in the transitive way. So loading and loading and loading of resources, having so many transitive cross-references, so you have to resolve the world to solve a very small problem. And obviously, this is sometimes not a good idea. So when I come to a customer, sometimes they are very thrilled to tell me what they have done. So sometimes they say, we have more than 20 DSLs. I don't know if this is really an indicator for good work, but might be. If the DSLs really fit to the things that you want to solve with it, and they're not there just for building another DSL. Then sometimes they have more than 200 lines of code in one file. Obviously, modeling seems to be something different than programming. It isn't. It's the same thing. It's more or less programming, but in another language. So what would you do with a Java developer that writes methods that have 2,000 lines of code? You'll fire him. But for people that are building DSLs with 200 lines of code in one simple file, that's great, obviously. They think it's great. It isn't. Sometimes I've seen in one customer project, I've seen that they check in broken models. I didn't really understand why. And then they said to me, oh, don't worry, we generate the stuff that is missing. I asked why. And then they said, to make it valid again. And after that, we can generate things out of it. Okay. So that means you have broken models, you generate out of the error markers the missing stuff, and then you generate things out of it. What the heck are you doing there? But sometimes we are facing that. And then the next thing is, of course, they are on an old release, and they can't update. And sometimes they ask us to report things that we have done in the newer things, like the index improvements that we did. And that should change. Because the people that are using Xtext there, they say it's incredibly slow, because the developers of the DSLs did not really tweak their languages. You can do a lot to make it more smooth and feeling better. It's not only UI stuff, it's about performance, it's about making things fast. And only when there is no way out, they try to improve. And that is, in the most scenarios, that is my work in the project. I'm together with my colleagues, and before that, together with my friends from Typefox, we are solving that problems. So they really need an expert, and they are not really into the internals. And today, I would like to invite you to participate a little bit on the stuff that we have done at the customers, so that you get an impression what you can do in your DSLs. So of course, first thing is please update. Why? We are always releasing new things, and we don't do that because we can. No, we do that because we are fixing bugs. So why should I update? It's very obvious, because we killed bugs. And please, don't live with your workarounds forever. Please file bugs, and then we can solve it, and then you have to update, and you will gain a lot. You don't have to maintain all the stuff on your own. You get it from us. That is our job. You will get speed. I was at a customer in Zurich, and I don't want to tell the name, of course, but they did something that was incredibly slow. And the only thing that we did is 2 lines of code that we changed, and we'll come to that point later, and it was half the time. And then we updated to a new version of Xtext, and we came down to 29 seconds from 4 minutes at the beginning. So that's extraordinary what you can do if you stay with a new, or you update to the new version of Xtext. And even if you say, we have so much customization in our project, we can't update, please try it. Just try it. You don't have to work directly with a new version in production. Try to update and see what's broken. And when that is too much, of course, then you have to make a decision. But please try it. By the way, resolving cross-reference has never been faster with the current release. So just as an indicator, we updated from 2.8 to 2.8.4, and it made only half the time in the scoping. Some of my colleagues did there a lot in the indexing. I didn't, but they did it, and I was amazed what's doable there. So sometimes, of course, you can update because of new features. Currently, it's everything around making Xtext work in other platforms, and that's super. And we will see what's in the pipeline. Okay, and last thing, because when you update, you can file bugs, and we can work together. And currently, we are on GitHub. We will stay on GitHub. And it's such a great platform for getting more contributors to Xtext. And please contribute. Making a mistake is not a problem. If you have something that will bring Xtext further, please do it. And yeah, we will not blame you, not at all. So the talk is about performance, and I said what you should do, why you should update. So let's come to the point, what about performance? The most problems happen in validation, index and scoping, complex generators, and of course, memory consumption. And we will go all through that points, and hopefully we can get through all points. At the end, there is one very special thing, and I hope I can present it. Sometimes the people claim they need Xbase, because the language is complicated. And when I ask them, could you please elaborate why? I can't explain why. That's always the answer, not always. Some people really use Xbase because they use expressions, and they really have a use case where it's completely useful for. But other people just use it because they want to reference an E operation. That doesn't make sense. That's a simpler way to do that. But then they claim there is this small corner case, and I can't really solve that with my own typing system, blah, blah. Try it before you go with Xbase. Xbase is great, but it's only great if you really have a use case where this thing fits. It's a big elephant, by the way. You have a very big grammar. If you want to tweak that grammar, because you can, then you will face ambiguities in the grammar. It's not easy to solve. So if you have a small problem, try to solve it without Xbase. If you have a problem that could be solved by Xbase because you need the complete expression stuff, use Xbase. I think all of you know validations in Xtext are great. But the people use always the default. The default is a fast validation. Please really remind yourself, fast should mean fast. It's triggered every time you stop typing. After 500 milliseconds, the reconciler kicks in and triggers a lot of things, and validation is one of the things. And sometimes it's a good idea to use validations, normal validation that got triggered when you save. Scoping is so complicated, it's the next thing that we always hear. And sometimes when it works for the first time, they just stick with the implementation. They don't want to touch that because it's so complicated. Obviously, it is sometimes complicated, yes, I have to admit. And sometimes when we come to a project and we change something because we think we know what we're doing there, then they say, it worked before you touched it. And I have tests that really prove that you're wrong. Sometimes the tests are wrong. And sometimes you really have to rethink about things when you want to tweak your language. So what's the problem with scoping? There's a lot of things involved in scoping. And you might have seen some of the implementations. And you might wonder about the batch linkable resource, derived state, and all that stuff. Yes, it's complicated, but you don't need everything from that. And of course, eco-utils resolve all is not your friend. We put a lot of effort in Xtext to make it lazy loading. If you resolve all the cross-references eagerly, you break that. And so it will make you slow, and it will load the world. You just avoid using that stuff. The scoping API, you might already know that, and some people like that. Same for my projects. At the beginning, we introduced that to make things easier. There's convention, you have to call it scope, after that the name of the element, and then the feature. And then it's magically triggered. Sometimes you wonder how it is triggered. You might have a look at the polymorphic dispatcher that is using reflections and call that methods in a reflective way. Of course, that is error-prone, because magic is not always a good thing. When you write that method in your implementation and you change your grammar, then this might not get called and you will not recognize it. And nobody will tell you that. And your tests are broken and you wonder why. And of course, it's slow. Recently in a project, we changed that from the reflective way to an explicitly way, and that made around 10%. So please override get scope and do it explicitly. Don't use the API anymore. Because if you change your grammar to Xbase, it will not work anyway. Because Xbase itself does not inherit from the implementation that makes that magic happen. So sometimes people are confused. They are switching to Xbase and nothing works anymore. Scope provider. Caches. Some of you might already have done that. The scope provider is triggered a lot of times. So for each cross-reference, the scope provider is asked for a bunch of elements that are visible at a certain place. And it calculates that stuff over and over again, even when there's no change. So please cache that. There are simple implementations for that, and invalidate it when it's necessary. That means if something really changes that is inside of the scope, and that made a lot. So in different, I don't know, numbers, and it's always difficult to bring numbers to you, it will bring a lot of difference in the meaning of performance. Sometimes people tend to pollute the scope provider. I can really say pollute. They put something from outside through, I don't know what extension points, to the global scope provider. He's smiling because I don't want to say the name. They do that, and that's incredibly slow because they sometimes forget to cache. And they calculate all that stuff that is polluted into the global scope provider over and over again. And we changed that, and that made half the complete runtime of the builder. So one thing to remember, you should never do something in the global scope provider that feels odd, because there is an index, and there is a reason why we have that index. Please do your stuff in the index. and I will tell you why, and I will tell you how. So the index is very powerful. It stores information around visible things in your workspace. And visible things could be resources and the exported stuff inside of the resources. So pretty simple to say, holds or lightweight representations of referenceable elements and their resources. So there's this magic thing, the resource description and the object description. Both of them are representing things on your workspace in a lightweight representation. The index is fast because it's a hash map. It has a lot of maps. But one very super fast hash map is the hash map that stores the qualified name. That's a multi-map that stores to one qualified name a bunch of elements with that name, because there could be more than one. And we did that change in 2.x. I don't know exactly which version it was. And it increased the performance a lot. And some people were not able to jump on the new release, and they stick with something with 1.x. And that is why I said at the beginning, could you please backport that stuff for us? And we did it, and it brought a lot, but at the end, it was never really used. They'd spent that money for the trash can. So please update. And it's your index. It's not the index of Xtext. It's your index, and you are the one who should fill it. There are default implementations that do the trick, but there is a lot of things that you can put in the index that are very useful. So how can I feed it? And the builder picks up DSL files and loads them one by one. So that's easy. Next thing is it creates resource descriptions through the resource description manager. The manager is responsible for giving the answer of who's affected when there is a change, and of course, how should I create a resource description for your special language. And to make that easier, we introduced, I don't know which version it was, but we introduced a resource description strategy so that you don't have to overwrite the resource description manager. It's a lot of code. Nowadays, it's only one binding, because in Xtext we're using dependency injection, and you have one method, and then you're done. And the default, and maybe some of you don't know that, the default of Xtext is everything that has a name goes into the index. In Java, what you say that it is a good idea to make everything public? No, because sometimes information hiding is a good thing, and that's also true for DSLs. So in the resource description strategy, there's a very simple thing that you can do. There is a Boolean that is the return type of the method create the object description, and that says if for this element there should be a representation in the index or not. The default implementation says if it has a name, it goes into the index. You should tweak that, and only things that should be visible from outside of the resource should be in the index. Everything else is in the resource, and that's not a problem. And there is the other thing, user data. You can put special information in the index to solve your problems. And that will, of course, save memory and time. User data, what for? You can use that for, of course, validations. Sometimes the answer could be already in the index, and you don't have to calculate things. And the other thing could be scoping. In some scenarios, and I spoke to him recently, to solve problems, sometimes it's necessary to resolve cross-references even in the scope provider. To avoid that, you can put extra information in the index that will help you in solving your problem without being eagerly loading things. Referencing non-Xtext models, that's another thing. If you want to do that, people sometimes create their own global scope provider and do it. Already said that's not a good idea. What you can do is you can put that stuff inside the index, and you can bind an own resource service provider. There's an extension point to do that. For your special language, there is no need that this language is an Xtext language. Could be something that implements the contract of EMF. And when you do that, then you can put them in the index, and you make cross-references, then navigable. You can navigate them. Sometimes people put things in the index without really having a physical resource behind it. Sometimes they get information out of the database or from other models. And then when you press F3 on something, normally it opens up an editor where the corresponding area is highlighted, where the element is defined. When you do a very dirty trick in bringing that stuff into the global scope provider without the index, it might not get navigated. And there is a special implementation to help you in doing that, the generic resource service provider. It will automatically put everything that has a name inside of the index, and then you can have the default implementation for the resource description strategy that exactly put that things into the index, and you're done. It's pretty simple, so please do that. Yeah, but sometimes people claim when I introduce resource service provider for everything, then the builder takes ages, because it has to iterate over all the stuff that is inside the workspace and even in jars. Does it really make sense to collect things out of jars and put them over and over again in the index? No, not really. A jar statically, so why not putting the index into the jar and load it instead of loading all the models and then creating the index? It's not that easy, I have to admit. We did that for customers. Sorry, it's not open source, but it's not that hard because the index is serializable. And the user data that you put inside of your object descriptions should be serializable. That's the contract. And then you can put it in a file. By the way, Xtext stores the index inside the meta area of your workspace and load it again when you open up Xtext, open up Eclipse again. That is why the builder doesn't run when you start Eclipse again. If you terminate it, of course, it's not serialized. And then people say, okay, I have that index thing, but that works in the IDE. What about standalone? Standalone means without Eclipse running up somewhere in Maven or in Arnd or whatever, Gradle. It's very, very slow. Sometimes we have seen people building custom standalone implementations where they have their own solution of loading things without dealing with the index. The index is there, and you just have to, it's usable in standalone, I have to say. It's not there, you have to do it. But there is a very simple solution to that. Once upon a time, the resource set global scope provider was the default. It searched the world inside the resource set to find a simple thing, and that took ages. And nowadays, we have a better solution. And when you consume our plugin, the Maven plugin or the Gradle plugin, it's already done for you. But if you have your special implementation, why, I don't know, you have that, then you have to do something. One thing is you have to load each resource without resolving cross-references and building the index out of it. The index is represented in a simple class. The name of the class is resource description data. Within that, you will find the index. You have to create it. And after that, you have to install it in the resource set. And then you have the very same fastness as you have it in the IDE, in your standalone scenario. Pretty simple. And that really saved the ass of a lot of people in the past. Sometimes we have projects where the builder took, I don't know, 6 minutes. And after doing that, it's down to something around half a minute. And that really makes a big difference. And it's only 10 minutes to do that. So everything you have seen on the last slide is enough to solve that problem. So please do that. Code generators, next thing. They are so slow. Everybody likes code generators. That is an engineer. But people that have to use that, they hate that because it took so long. Of course, when we ask, how do you generate your stuff? They say, we use a workflow. How should you solve it in a different way? That was 10 years ago. And some people invoke the workflow even in the IDE. Come on, we have that incremental code generator in the IDE. What the hell do you do with MWE2? Of course, we have to admit in the IDE we are triggering the code generator for Xtext with the workflow, but that is for historical reasons, and it works fine. Incremental code generators, if you want to use that, and you should, it's triggered by the builder, of course. If there is a change somewhere in a file and you save it, then Xtext will calculate the impact on your change and will trigger a build for the affected resources. The default implementation is smart, but it could be better because it's a common solution and you have to implement the isAffected method in the resource description manager to make that better. Sometimes it doesn't really see that something is affected, and so sometimes you end up in scenarios where things are broken. It's not only about code generators. The same thing is done for validation and building the index and all that. Sometimes people claim we can't use that because Xtext is having that interface iGenerator. Nowadays it's iGenerator 2. We tend to have a number at the end. There you have one resource, and for that one resource you can generate stuff. And sometimes you have the scenario where you have a bunch of elements and you want to generate a configuration file that contains all the names of the different elements. And obviously, it's not coming out of the box to do that with an incremental code generator. To solve that problem, you can introduce merging strategies for the file that you want to aggregate the names in. That's a little bit of effort, but it's worth the effort to do that. And there is the parallel builder participant. Who has heard about that class? Some? Okay, that's triggering code generators in parallel on different threads. That makes sense when you have a very big infrastructure and a lot of models. That makes completely sense. But you have to be very careful because EMF is not thread safe. And because of that, if you trigger parallel generators that will lazily resolve cross-references, you will sometimes end up in deadlocks. So it's a good idea to resolve the word, in this case, before you trigger the parallel builder participant. But nowadays, you have 16 gigabytes of RAM, so it should work. Gigabytes of RAM, next point, memory consumption. Sometimes 16 gigabytes are not enough. I was at a customer that claimed that when he wants to build his whole workspace, the machine has to have over 20 gigabytes of RAM. Otherwise, the heap is not enough to do that. That was correct when analyzing the data. But the default implementation in Xtext is the disabled clustering policy. You might not have heard about that. That is a policy that will be asked if the memory is not enough anymore in the heap. And so the default implementation is never unloading stuff. But there is another implementation, the dynamic resource clustering policy, that was contributed by a customer that really had problems with big models. And what they do there is they have a look at the memory, the free memory, and depending on that, it frees up memory. So freeing memory up means unloading things. And that could be a worth thing if you have resources that are always loaded and you unload them each time. That's a lot of performance for the trash can. So how do we solve that problem? In the scenario that I just mentioned, the 20 gigabytes of RAM, we found out, of course, with tools like YoKit, that most of the things are strings. And why? Because there is that node model. Who knows the node model? Okay, I don't have to explain too much. The node model stores the syntax tree with text and positions. Let's see, you have a grammar, and within that grammar you have a parser rule, and that will end up in an object in the AST. But when you have a validation and you want to highlight a special part of that object, you have to find out where it's located and what's the length of the stuff. And the node model can answer that question. You can ask the node model, where's the position of which feature? And we use that widely everywhere in the framework. But it produces a lot of strings in memory. And during the builder runs, you do not really need it, because the only thing that the node model can be asked for is a special position. And during the builder runs, you want to have scoping, and in scoping you should not rely on the node model, honestly. And in the validation, the very same. But the validation will use the node model implicitly to find out where to highlight things. But there is a solution. So switching off the node model, I know it's dirty, but it will help. It's not a common thing, and that's the last point that I want to bring to you. Switching off the node model has a lot of implications, and we will come to that point. The parser creates it, so if you want to switch off, you have to override the parser, and then you will see it, all the proxies are not resolvable anymore, because the node model is consulted and installed as an adapter on the object to install the proxies afterwards. So you have to find a solution to do that. What I did is I collected the necessary things for the cross-references, put that as an adapter on the object, and then when the proxies are installed, I use my adapters. But this stuff around that is not there anymore in memory, and that will really save your ass. But if you open up an editor, you want to see the right things that are highlighted. So we have to introduce a strategy to do that. And you might know in the resource set there are these load options, and this is an indicator if you're in the indexing phase or not. I mean, if the builder is running, the load options are differently compared to if the editor is open. So in your implementation, you have to take care that depending on the load option, you have to do things different. And what are the implications? Obviously, you cannot use the node model anymore in your scoping and in your validation implementation. Sometimes people do that. It's not good practice, but sometimes it's, practically. But if you want to go with this solution, switching off the node model, you can't do that anymore. It will highlight the position 0.0, that means the up left corner in the editor, and all your markers that are created by the validator will point to that point, 0.0. But if you open up the editor, there is a thing, editor callback, and there's one implementation to trigger the validation another time, and then it will highlight the right position because you have taken the load option into account. And depending on is the editor open or not, you do things different. But please don't use this as a common strategy for your first TSL. And don't do that if you don't really have problems with memory. You really should be in the big shit before you do that, because it's more or less a hack. And last thing, I've been at a customer where they have a lot of models, and the builder took ages, and we tried to improve the scoping, and that didn't help. And at the end, we end up in thinking, sometimes files might belong together, and maybe it's a good strategy to load them together, because we can't hold everything in our heap, but if we do the right thing at the right place, then it might be faster, and it turned out as a good idea. If you have models that are located in the same folder and they belong together, load them together. And you can do that by overriding the builder. There is a to-be-built computer that you can override, and then you can bring the files in the right order. That makes sense. Sometimes files get loaded more than once. If you have something like a library where all your types that you want to refer are in one file, then please don't unload that file. It should be always present in the memory. And as I already said, sometimes it makes sense to not unload them at all. So now you know how to solve problems. And for those who didn't understand everything, that was, by the way, not my intention. It was just giving you ideas. And if you do not really know how to solve that, please consult us. We are giving professional support, by the way. Okay, questions?